August 27th. I'd like to welcome the commissioners and citizens to the Parks and Recreation Commission meeting. I'd like to start with a roll call, please, Natalie.
Commissioner Cribbs?
Here.
Commissioner Greenfield? Commissioner Lemire?
Here.
Commissioner McCulley? Commissioner McDougall?
Here.
Commissioner Moss?
Here.
Commissioner Rechtel? Councilmember McCormick?
Here.
Thank you. I understand that at least Commissioner Rechtel will be late, and I haven't heard from Commissioner McCauley. I'd like to ask if there are any agenda changes, requests, deletions from the published agenda. Does staff or commissioners have anything that they'd like to suggest? I have no cards for oral communications for topics that are not on the agenda. So I'd like to start with welcoming Darren Anderson and the department report.
Good evening, Darren Anderson. Thanks so much. I'll give you a couple brief items. First one's about the black and white ball. Just a reminder, it's Friday, October 4th, 7 p.m. to midnight at Lucy Stern, and tickets are still available. They're $150 each and available online. There's an ice cream social at Hoover Park. This is the 25th annual Midtown Ice Cream Social on Sunday, September 15th from 1 to 4 at Hoover Park. So far, Chair McDougall and I are signed up to staff a table, provide information on parks and open space and recreation. And it's wonderful. Excellent. I hadn't heard that yet. That's terrific. Thank you. Commissioner Greenfield had asked about some lighting issues at two of our parks. The lights, a couple bulbs were out at El Camino Park and Stanford Palo Alto. At El Camino Park, they were replaced on Monday and today, so we're back up and running. And then we're getting a price quote for a little electrical fire we had on an outlet that powered one of the lights, or a few of the lights at Stanford Palo Alto. So we're getting a price quote on that. We'll get it fixed promptly. Update on the Coverly Track and Field project. It's progressing well and we're still on track. About a third of the field has the new pad and the new synthetic turf down. The turf crew that's working on this will be out next week to finish the field installation. Anticipated total turf installation should be done by September 18th, and then they'll address the track, which should be completed by September 30th, and wrapping up the whole project on October 4th. An update on the 3350 Birch Street, or AT&T property. On August 19th, Council authorized the city manager to finalize the purchase of the vacant lot at 3350 Birch Street. The city manager will provide a seller the written notice to proceed with the sale by August 30th, and closing is scheduled to take place 15 days after that. Subsequent steps I envision will be park dedication for the property and community outreach to figure what the community would like to do with the land. Pickleball, got good news, we received our final permit for approval. I think I notified the commission via email. The work is underway and the project is anticipated to be completed by November 15th. The Coverly Master Plan, unfortunately I don't have a lot of details. Kristen's planning to get more information and hopefully update you either by email in the interim or perhaps at our next staff meeting. The draft master plan is complete. It's under internal review right now. Commissioner had asked about review on behalf of the commission, and Kristen says she's coordinating with the city manager and PUSD on this issue to make sure we're in alignment about the release of the plan. So more information to come. Also good news on the Adaro Community Garden. This is our newest community garden. Staff's been putting in the irrigation, clearing out old debris, and building the plots. It'll be about 35 plots, which should be ready for gardeners to start using in about 1 month from now. We already have 9 people on our waiting list, which is exciting, so people are geared up to start moving in once we're ready. I also had a question about Bull Park and a project Public Works had been looking at for a GSI, or underground water storage at that site. And this is several months ago. They had investigated the possibility of putting an underground reservoir there and GSI features, and the community had weighed in not in favor by and large, and we asked about what's the current status. Public Works informed me that that was just a preliminary look, and they're not currently looking at it any longer. Their GSI plan has other higher priority sites for GSI improvements, so Bull Park's not on their agenda or calendar. Also received a question about some recent surveys at the Baylands. Save the Bay, who's our primary partner for restoration at that site, is out doing some vegetation monitoring around the marsh along Bixby. This is just part of their regular efforts, so they're out there removing invasive weeds and planting a tremendous number of native plants, and they monitor those areas regularly. But we also had Team Spartina. This is a team dedicated to one specific invasive plant called the Invasive Spartina plant. We have it at the Baylands and have had it for quite some time. They've tracked it over the years, and they did an annual pre-treatment survey of it. The good news is our infestation is down about 90% from its peak in 2006, and now we have approximately 0.14 acres. We're just continually whittling it down with ongoing sustained efforts. I also had a question about sea level rise, just kind of what's next, keeping that fresh and relevant. The next step, I think, is going to be Public Works will be bringing the horizontal levee project for the commission to discuss in October, tentatively. And that concludes the department report.
Before I ask the commission whether they have any questions for staff, I would like to remind everybody to make sure you're using the mic and you're speaking into the mic. Apparently, we've recently lost some of the valuable, extremely valuable conversations that we've had and haven't been sufficiently recorded, and that's just disastrous. So please plan on speaking up. I will ask if anybody has any questions for staff at this point. Ann?
Just two comments. One, great news on the pickleball. I'm sure that the community will be very excited about that, and I hope we're going to plan a celebration. So that's just great. I was so happy to see that come. And then for the track and for the field at Cubberley, are you doing something to publicize all that?
Yes, I think both will probably get a ribbon cutting.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet.
Does anybody else have any questions? I would like to echo the pickleball excitement. On the Bull Park, that was something that GSI decided was a good project. Do we have any understanding of what citizen objections were to that project?
You know, I don't think they got a fair chance to hear a lot about it. I don't think there was a public presentation on it. And I think I'm probably not the right one to give all the details, but I'll ask Public Works to come back at some point. I think they'll be here in November for sure. And maybe they give a litany of updates, and that could be one of them where we're at with GSI.
Okay, I think that would be good because they were pretty passionate about GSI and the things they could do. And then it would be worth understanding what citizen objections were.
You bet.
On Baylands, Spartina is a kind of cordgrass, right?
That's correct.
And does that mean that all cordgrass is bad, or that all the rest of the cordgrass that we have there is good cordgrass?
Very good question, and it's really tricky, especially at our site. So there is an East Coast variety, Spartina alterniflora, and it was introduced on accident in the East Bay. It migrated all through San Francisco Bay, and you can tell differences until it hybridized. So we've got a native Spartina, native cordgrass, and now we've got this alterniflora, the East Coast variety, and now we have a hybrid. And it's really, really difficult to discern the differences. Sometimes you have to time it just right in terms of its growth, and sometimes you have to inspect the roots. So it's very, very difficult, and hence this team of specialists that are really, really good. Lots of times we'll take samples and send them to Cornell to have them genetically tested to ensure we're going after the right ones.
I was going to say it sounds exciting. I'm not sure exciting is the right word. It certainly sounds interesting and impressive. So thank you for that, unless there are any other questions. So David?
So regarding the horizontal levee, there's a demo for the subcommittee this Friday.
A tour to Orloma, as I understand it, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the AT&T property, that's fantastic news, and I hope it proceeds as well. We've only had a couple of new additions over the past four years, so this is going to be really a big update.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. So the next item business is the approval of the draft minutes from July 23rd. Do I have any comments, questions, or can I have a motion? David?
I wanted to acknowledge that my updates to the minutes in the form of a memo were added to the record for others to see, and I hope we can talk about that later.
And the same for the comments and written response from Commissioner Greenfield. So in fact, I think in fact, would it be appropriate for us to somehow acknowledge that in that we're approving the amended minutes, or is it just the minutes as have been presented? Does that make any difference? Natalie, do you have a comment?
So the memos aren't actually added to the minutes. They're added to the agenda from last meeting. So there would be no change to the minutes. The memos are just posted for public record on the agenda.
Yeah, so we can just approve the minutes and
You
not,
could
we don't
just
need to
approve the
note
minutes.
anything.
Yeah, the memos are already public record.
Great, thank you. In that case, can I have a motion, please?
I move to approve the minutes.
Can I have a second?
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So that has passed. So the next item,
Chair McDoodle,
yes,
may I ask a question about the minutes now that they've been approved?
yes, please.
Great. Mr. Anderson, I noted in the minutes that there was going to be outreach about Ramos Park in August. Has that been completed?
I'm
or
sorry, it
started?
has not yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how broadly, just for my understanding, when you're doing outreach for a park, how broadly do you do a half-mile perimeter to notify people, or how does that work?
Approximately, yeah. It depends sometimes on the layout of the park and what the nearest surrounding neighborhood looks like. If it's residents quite a ways, we'll try to broaden it out a little bit more, and if it's commercial, sometimes less.
And
in a
the
certain area.
schools, you'll contact the schools, et cetera?
Schools, and for sure, the commission has always sent an email.
Notified? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
If there are no other questions, I'd like to welcome back Jocelyn LeBlanc, who has given us interesting presentations and so on before, and invite her to give us an update on the park visitation study that was done in the summer.
Thank you very much. I'm Jasmine LeBlanc from the Community Services Department. So I am here to present a urban park utilization study that our department was able to conduct this summer. We hired a fantastic summer intern that we would have really liked to have her here, but she's already gone back to college. So it's Megan Schmessing. She's a local young person who is entering her senior year of Pitzer College, studying environmental analysis. And she was able to work with us on a variety of projects, while this was the biggest project that she worked on. And so the reason that we asked her to do an urban park utilization study is we actually don't have a good sense of how many people are using our urban parks. So open spaces is something that we've been able to track because there are fewer entry points, but urban parks are a different animal. And so this was something that we thought would be valuable. It does come up. Both Darren and I will get calls somewhat regularly asking how many people use our different types of parks and in what ways. So this is the reason behind doing this survey. So I was afraid of this. Let's see. Okay. So Megan developed a survey methodology that was, or actually before I jump into the methodology, the point of this is to have a better understanding of how people are using our parks in what ways.
Could I ask you to move the microphone a little closer to you? I think it's probably hard for people to hear.
Is that a little better?
That's better.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So the point of this survey was to better understand how our parks are used and not base it just on anecdotes or other methods like how much trash is accumulating in one park or another.
This is not coming up on the scan converter on the TV broadcast, and I don't know why. There's a blank screen for the scan converters.
Any suggestions?
What kind of
It's on here.
VGA?
Can I ask, do you mind if we continue with the presentation?
Yeah, sure. I'll figure it out.
Please, sorry for the.
Okay, no worries. All right, so that's a bit of the background for the survey. I will briefly discuss, so we only had one person who was working on this survey, so we did have to narrow in on just a few parks. We chose to look at 8 parks. The list of parks was developed closely with Darren and his staff, actually, to make sure we were getting a good sort of variety of different types of parks, sizes, and locations across the city. Oh, I'm sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. And we used a survey methodology that was developed by San Diego State University and the RAND Corporation to be able to get a relatively accurate picture of park usage. So this was systematic observations of parks just during the summer, so we're looking at summer data only, throughout the day and throughout the week. In addition to doing the surveys or observational study, we also asked Megan to ask a 10-question survey. And she did get a relatively small sample, but it's still valuable information. I wouldn't try to extrapolate it to the entire population of Palo Alto, but it gives us an interesting picture. This is just a brief overview of kind of how she gathered the methodology, or gathered the data, excuse me. So basically each park is broken into segments, and she's counting users in each part of the park. There's a possibility that she's double counting people or miscounting people, but overall we felt like this was going to give us a reasonably good data set. So some of the big findings are here. You can look and see how many people are using the 8 parks that we surveyed in an average week in the summer. And in terms of putting this into a bigger picture, the national average is somewhere in between Eleanor Party Park and Juana Briones Park. So Party Park is about 10% more used if you're looking at people per acre than the typical park at the national level. And you can see some of our parks are significantly above that. So when you look at the average across all 8 of these parks, we have about twice as many users in Palo Alto parks as we do in the average park in America. So I'll go pretty quickly through these slides, but you can see that we have relatively even distribution of people in parks at different times of day. Obviously, there are some peaks with the most people around the lunchtime hours, but it's pretty even. There are more users on weekends than weekdays across the parks, about 20% more on a weekend. And it's pretty even distribution if you're looking at it by gender. When you look at age, there are more noticeable differences, with the most people in our parks being children, and then a lot of adults. But when you pull out just adults who appear to be there to observe kids in the park, you get a lot fewer adults. So about half of the adults that are in parks are there primarily to watch their children. And then as we compare the usage of parks with the demographics in Palo Alto, you can see that children are overrepresented in the parks and seniors are underrepresented in parks across Palo Alto. And again, this is what the surveyor observed. Then she broke out essentially the three larger parks in the survey as regional parks. So Mitchell Park, Greer, and actually I think it was Piers and Pardee as well, compared with the smaller parks to see if there were differences in usage. So you can see a little bit of difference. And then we also looked at how people were using the parks and found that quite a few people are engaged in something that is either vigorous exercise or walking or more. This was pretty different than other surveys found. So for instance, in LA, when they did a similar park survey, they found that about 2/3 of the people in parks were sedentary, so relaxing at benches or picnicking, things like that. And we have sort of a flipped image here of people who are pretty active. And this is something that other park surveyors have really focused on because physical activity is so important. Looking at particular activities, our surveyor actually separated Magical Bridge from other playground use because it was such a popular activity on its own. But definitely when you add playground use and Magical Bridge, you can see that is a hugely popular thing to do in our urban parks. But there's a variety of things that are happening. When you focus in just on what was observed amongst seniors, you get a bit of a different picture where there are definitely more people doing things like walking, sitting, picnicking, playing pickleball was a very popular activity she observed among seniors, Tai Chi, etc. We also asked to focus in on dogs at the parks and found that the new Piers Park Dog Park is very popular. And she saw a lot of people with dogs there. The Mitchell Park dog area seemed to also be quite popular. And she did observe some dogs in the Greer Park dog run, but similar number of dogs that were on the fields at Greer Park rather than actually in the dog run, and some other dogs off leash in other parks. Oh, and I already said what's on this slide, so I'll move on. So we asked to focus in on specific parks in particular, and as I already mentioned, the most common activity at Mitchell Park was using the Magical Bridge playground, using the other playgrounds, picnicking, using the pickleball courts were other popular activities. Because she spent so much of the summer in parks, part of what we asked is, can you look for some other observations that you're just picking up on by being in our parks for hours and hours all summer, and speaking with people? So she identified some potential improvements we could make, especially I would say there's a consistent pattern that people want to be in the shady spots no matter what. So that was some of the things that she heard and observed around dog parks and so on. In looking at Greer Park, this park was more popular in terms of actually playing sports on the fields, and then playing at the park and walking or jogging. El Camino Park is a bit different because it is primarily ball fields, And so what she saw during the summer, I think, speaks to that. What she saw appeared to be people in summer camps for particular sports. And in the particular times she observed, there were some pretty dramatic differences amongst gender in that park, which is, I think, worth noting, and it's worth us keeping an eye on, but this really may be a statistical blip because of the nature of whatever that camps were in the given weeks she was there. So Pierce Park was one that she noted was really utilized to the max, that every inch was well used. And I think that's particularly true now that the dog park is in kind of the back, but dog park, picnicking, playgrounds, and summer camps were all popular activities she observed. Party Park, this is one that I mentioned is about 10% above the average in terms of use, and what she saw was similar playgrounds, playing on the fields, walking, people gardening. And this was one that she noted had the highest use amongst teenagers, but it's hard to know exactly what was driving that. And in the cases where she saw teens there, it was more field, playing on the field, in formal or informal sports. Juana Briones Park, the playgrounds are popular, and she noted the playground with shade is much more popular than the playground without shade. There's two playgrounds at that park. Scott Park, this is one of the smaller parks, and so it had a lot more people who were really just using it as a place to walk through. But she did see that the bocce ball courts were used, especially on weekends. Sarah Wallace Park might be the smallest park that we looked at, I think it is. And she did see that this park actually does get a decent amount of use, especially during the lunch hour, for people who just want to come for a place to relax. And so I'll go through the park visitor survey, which does have a small sample size right now of, I think, about 40. So this is something that we've put up on our city website, and we'd like to advertise a little more to just collect more data, find out how people are using our parks a little more. So for the people that she surveyed, she found that people are in parks very frequently, daily or several times a week. People are going to parks that are near their home, and they're generally walking or driving to the park. The reason they're coming is kind of what she observed. They're coming to go to the playground, to go for a walk, or to bring their dog somewhere. The reason they chose the park is generally because it's the closest park, but sometimes there's some particular amenity that's drawing them to that park. And in general, they feel very safe in our parks and feel that the parks are either very clean or fairly clean and attractive. And then we did find that about 3/4 of the survey respondents were Palo Alto residents. So the conclusions that we drew from this were that Palo Alto parks are being well used, more than twice as much use per acre as we saw in other national surveys. A lot of attractions are a big draw, so having a really great playground, and you can see that with Mitchell Park, is going to pull a lot of people in. Other popular activities are having walking paths for walking or jogging, nice dog parks, open lawn space for people to play sports or just relax are popular. And then organized activities are drawing a lot of people. There was a bit of a bias to having more males than females in the parks. And we saw a lot of physical activity, as I mentioned, higher than other surveys. And Mitchell Park is very popular. So some of the next steps, I think that we thought it would be interesting to look at the same data in different times of year to see if, you know, we can get a better sense of our annual use in parks. It might be useful to look at some of our other parks, and I think it would be valuable. As I mentioned, we still have the survey up, and it would be great to get more people to respond to the survey. And then if we are continuing to find, as we get more data, that we do have you know, some mismatches in terms of demographics. If we only have about a third of our seniors coming into the parks, that's something that we may want to really look at as we develop new amenities or new programming. So that is the conclusion of this presentation. Thank you.
Jasmine, thank you. I think that was particularly interesting. I'm going to start with Anne because she has her light on already.
No, I don't. I do. Okay, well, good, I do. Thank you very much.
Then we'll go in that direction.
So,
And I'm sorry, excuse me. I forgot. We do have one. We do have one speaker card. Shawnee Kleinhaus, you have item number 2. Is this? Would you like to speak on this? Yeah. Sorry, Ann.
I wrote some notes on this, and thank you. My name is Shani Kleinhaus. I'm the environmental advocate for Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. I also live in Palo Alto. I like the results of this. I think it's very informative, the survey, but I think that 5:30 is too early in June and July to see the people who come out in the evening. So having the survey done at 5:30, you're not going to see the seniors, the people that stroll around, the people that walk with their dogs, the people that come out with the little kids. They come, sunset in those months is after 8, and people don't show up until 7:30, 7. But from my experience, that's when I see people there. So that's just a comment. A general comment is that I really think that this shows that we need to plant shade trees, and that big shade trees are important, especially oaks if possible. A couple of things about, one thing about Mitchell, I saw that there is comments there. I think one of the things that at Mitchell Park could be looked at is removing some of those lights. If you drive there at night, there's no people and there's a lot of light pollution. Other than that, maybe dog drinking fountains if you're going to continue developing that park. I think what was pretty clear is that the very little parks are not very functional. They only have people walking through, 61% at Scott Park and 40% walk through at Sarah Wallis. It's important to have people go through parks. It makes their day better, but I don't know that that's, but I think the pocket parks, the idea was that they'll have some kind of a attraction, like a gathering place, and I don't think they're doing that. And so one of the things I hope you discuss is what makes a gathering place, what's the minimum size for a functional park that actually provides more than a walk-through opportunity, which again, it's not unimportant, but it would be good to know what makes a gathering place. And I think shade would be good for seniors, but there's other things. And my usual pitch, add butterfly gardens, shade, and beauty. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. I would hope that we would do something in the wintertime or the fall or the spring, or if we could do it the 4 seasons, because I think it would be interesting to see the differences. I was interested in the way that maybe she counted there were more males than females using the park. That seemed different to me somehow, and maybe it's just an assumption on my part, but when I think about all the soccer teams and the baseball teams and all of that, I don't know how those were factored in, so just something to think about. And then on the whole idea of Sarah Wallace Park, that is like a little jewel in California Avenue, and there's so many people in California Avenue right now. We probably should put on some sort of a fun promotion to get people to come and have lunch there, on take a break or bring their lunch or something like that, because it's a lovely place to just go and spend some time kind of relaxing. That's all. But thank you, it was good.
Yeah, thank you.
David?
Thank you very much for doing this survey. The first question I have is, who calls you to know about these statistics and why?
The planning department will definitely call, trying to understand, I guess usage or where we might want to project, put more amenities in some place because it's heavily used, or other places they could use more. So I've gotten a few calls from planners. Darren could probably add, because I think he's been getting questions longer than I have.
Yeah, the only thing I would chime in is it's of course, a very, very commonly tracked statistic that parks should be tracking, and we just hadn't. And I am very grateful of this intern and her endeavors. I think it's really valuable, and I think it's absolutely certain that we're going to continue it.
So the planning department is internal. Do you also get other cities and do you also get national, does anybody from national want to know, do you feed into a national database, for instance?
We get a lot of questions from other park districts. Statewide, I know we've done, I don't recall getting a national survey, but I'm sure it's happened here and there. And oftentimes we put NA, not available information. So looking forward to changing that.
And then as far as the total number, you put the total number estimated for 8 parks, but of course we have a lot more parks. So that number is really big. I'm amazed, and I just wanted to make sure that we could extrapolate that to the other parks, and not only to the parks, but like Coverly Field and the field at Palo, Page Mill and El Camino, which would skew the activity levels and also the teen percentages as well, and also anyway, so I hope you're doing that as well.
Yes, we tried to have her consistently follow this methodology that's been developed by academics and statisticians, so that we can extrapolate. Our hope is that we can bring her back in her winter break. She's already said she has some time to do winter next, and since she knows what she's doing, she can jump right in without training, so that we can get year-round, and eventually, hopefully, we can add more of our parks. But this is definitely a good start for us.
Okay, and I echo the speaker about shaded playgrounds. And if you can't grow a tree fast enough, I would put gazebos over sections. And also, I was wondering if we did add restrooms to the parks, that we would track an increase in population usage when we add a bathroom. And we talked last meeting about adding those super porta potties in the interim. I would like to see some follow-up along those lines. And then also, we have special events at these parks, and they will regularly add a couple hundred people, but they're one-offs. So I don't know how you can put that into a survey, but it would be nice to make a footnote for those special events that we could have. And okay, that's all.
Thank you.
Ryan, do you have any comments?
Jasmine, this is great. Thank you very much for having Megan go out on this endeavor. I think that she's done an excellent job. I share your caution about the limitations on the survey responses because there's so few responses, but I think that her observational information that she's related here is really helpful. So well done, and I look forward to the next iteration.
Thank you.
Jeff?
Yeah, Jasmine, thank you so much for making a preliminary stab at gathering some data about our parks. With Megan coming back in the winter, are there any thoughts to already reaching out and figuring out if we can get a volunteer or add someone to her team to either gather more accurate data or survey additional parks?
I hadn't thought about that, but that is an excellent idea. Yeah, I think we could definitely try to find,
Yeah, and I don't know if there's any partnerships or it seems like it could be a valuable volunteer opportunity for somebody who's doing something that has to do with research. So I don't know if the junior colleges or even some of the high schools that could be of interest. And then how have we advertised the survey?
we haven't done
Okay.
much advertising yet. Yeah,
Okay.
so would like to push that
All right.
in the next few months.
Yeah, maybe posting something on Nextdoor or something like that might generate some interest from some people in the community. But thank you so much for this effort. It's great that we're starting to gather some data to help, see what we might be able to do or start to inform some of our decisions. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Jasmine, when I talked to you briefly before, I said I'd probably follow up with you separately, but I too echo everything everybody said. I think this is fantastic that we're doing it. I think Jeff's idea on volunteers, I would even suggest that we could contact environmental volunteers. They might be a candidate. I also think that this is the kind of project where we should be talking to Friends of Recreation, Friends of Palo Alto Recreation, to see if in fact they could participate in providing funding for something that would expand this, and I'd be glad to help with that. I'll run through a whole bunch of stuff, and I don't expect you to answer, and maybe we can have a discussion later. I assume that the survey that was done previously was done with kids and teens and adults and seniors or whatever. I'm not convinced, and certainly with the library, what the library did was they used a survey method that actually defined personas. And the personas were people that were active. And so saying, for example, I have friends that are almost my age that play soccer with the teens. And so I'm not sure how that gets captured here in terms of the way this is done. But the idea of personas, even within each of the categories, as opposed to just simply age groups, I think would be really meaningful. And that would better allow us to say, so what should we do about it? When it's just age groups, I'm not sure that it tells us what to do. You said that our park usage was 2 times the national average. If you had said 30% more, 20% more, or whatever, that wouldn't have raised a flag. But double says something, and it either says we don't have enough parks, and so our parks are crowded, or I'm not sure what it means. But if that's really a legitimate number, that deserves a serious drill down. When you talk about weekdays versus weekends being 20% different, that's sort of a little misleading, because in fact it's 40-60 when you look at it. And yes, that's 20% difference, but the usage is 40-60, and 40-60 isn't far away from 50-50. The numbers are different, but when it's presented as it's a huge difference, I think that's misleading. None of the activities have anything to do with nature. And one of the things that we explicitly know is that if you can get people out in parks, the Japanese call it forest bathing, and they go to a local park and forest bathe, and that's good for people. And we didn't capture any way of saying that. What we tended to say was that person was sitting on a bench, too bad. Well, maybe they were sitting on a bench soaking up nature, and that was not too bad. I think that one of the other things we need to do is we need to survey, for example, Heritage Park. Tuesday night, there's 30 dogs off leash. We need to know that in this survey. I've recently sent a thing about the Green Dog Program that's in Brookline, Massachusetts, where they have explicitly allowed off-leash dogs in non-fenced park areas at particular times, but only if the dog has a green tag. and the owner pays $100 or $50 if you're a resident and $100 if you're not a resident to get a green tag. That sounds to me like an interesting program that could cover an awful lot of sins in terms of costs and whatever else. And I think we should pursue that. I would like to echo what David said about bathrooms. To say we need more programs to get seniors out, I'm not so sure we don't need more bathrooms to get seniors out. One other little, the gathering place. I think the concept of gathering places, I've, for the last, I think, 10 years, convinced myself that I need to write a blog that's all about gatherings, whether it's animals or people or whatever. I think gatherings, if we want to talk about how do we encourage more, it's not so much the activities as facilitating gatherings. I think it's a really, really good term. And with that, I'll give you a call, and what I think you've done and you've had Megan do is spectacular. And I think doing more of that, and before we start doing an online survey, even thinking about what really are the questions we want to ask to make them relevant. And Councilmember Cormack, I didn't give you an opportunity before I jumped in, and I will now.
Thank you, Chair McDougall. Ms. LeBlanc, thank you so much for this, and please extend our thanks. And Ms. Schmiesing, how do you pronounce your last name? Schmiesing?
Schmessing?
Schmessing? Okay, Ms. Schmessing. It occurs to me that we had a number of interns this summer in the city, and perhaps the mayor's message in the next month might want to highlight interns. And if you get there first, perhaps the mayor's message would highlight this particular intern and her work. Because this is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people would be interested in. I'm grateful that Commissioner Lemire already mentioned next door. I think that'd be helpful. But this is more than just a survey. It was also, a work experience for someone who sounds like is a former student in our own community. So just wanted to offer that suggestion. Okay, curiosity, where is the horseshoe area at Mitchell Park? Like, how is there something at Mitchell Park? I don't know where it is.
In between the bowl and the parking lot, there's a horseshoe area.
Really?
It's
Is that the
It
thing
is.
that's like covered with like the wisteria? Is that horseshoe?
Between that and the grass.
I'll look more carefully the next time I walk my dog in Mitchell Park, on leash, I might point out. And then I do just want to emphasize the discussion around more of our senior citizens being able to use our parks, whether it's programming or bathrooms or what have you, I think is a fruitful one. So please do extend our thanks to Ms. Schmacing.
David?
One other thing that I forgot to mention is that there was a specific recommendation about parking, especially at Mitchell Park, and there is just no way we're going to add more parking. And so I think that ought to be noted, that may actually discourage additional attendance, but there's a lot of other things that we could do to mitigate that, but I just want to make a note of that. And the other thing is what Ann said about promotions to get special events in some of these smaller parks to get the public to know that they're there, I think is a really good idea that we should see if we can deal with.
Keith, we've just had a very interesting presentation by Jasmine relative to the survey that was sent out ahead of time. If you have any observations or questions you'd like to add, please feel free.
I'll put in my 2 cents. I noticed in the write-up you mentioned about shade and how that's attractive. I know when I walk through Bull Park during the lunchtime, if it's a shady bench, it's full. If it's a sunny bench, it's not. Although some days on winter days, that's flipped. But most of the time, the shade is preferred. And the other thing was seniors walking. I had relatives in town, and they were walking through the park, and they were not very mobile, and it was hard for them to go from one bench to the next. So if we can add benches, that would be appropriate. But it was very good, very interesting report. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, Jasmine, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm always glad when you bring controversy and discussion and numbers to our meeting. It's always enlightening. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much.
The next item on the agenda is the draft plan for the 7.7 acres.
Just one moment while we pull up the. Yes. Good evening, Darren Anderson with Community Services. I'm here tonight to talk about this draft plan for the 7.7 acre area of Foothills Park. My presentation will include a very brief background on the area and then walk through the draft plan. It's important to note that this draft plan is really just a starting place in our conversation with the community and stakeholders about how to use the land. Staff plans on hosting a community meeting soon to discuss the draft plan and collect their feedback. A little on the background, the 7.7 acre parcel was a gift from the Lee family to the city in 1981, and the Lee family retained an estate on the property until 1996. Between 96 and 2005, the city had leased the land to a private resident who owns the adjacent property. In 2014, council passed an ordinance dedicating the parcel as parkland and directed the commission to work with the community and develop ideas on how to use it. Staff hosted community meeting up at the park to collect feedback on what to do with this and gathered a variety of different feedback, some of which focused on recreational activities, potentially a dog park, additional camping, picnic areas, but the vast majority of the feedback really focused on different restoration opportunities for the site and wanted to see improved habitat. In January 2015, the issue came to the commission. We discussed the possible uses for the 7.7 acre area, and the commission recommended at the time that we complete the Buckeye Creek hydrology study before we program out and decide how to use this land. Staff did complete the study and was reviewed by the commission in January 2018. And the study incorporates recommendations for various improvements to these key issues of Buckeye Creek, mainly erosion and sedimentation. And it had three options to consider. One was upstream of Wild Horse Valley, another was in the middle section in Los Trampas, and a third in the 7.7 acre area. Well, the commission reviewed that along with staff and came up with a recommendation of focusing on the upper section. This is the Wild Horse Valley section. And that's ultimately went as an informational recommendation to City Council. So with that said, I want to say the draft we're going to discuss momentarily is not in conflict. If the city ever did want to pursue that option of improving the 7.7 acre area of Buckeye Creek, what we're proposing in this plan, this draft plan, would not be problematic or interfering with that if the city ever did want to pursue it. I should note the 7.7 acre area was open to the public on November 10th, 2018, and since that time, the rangers have kind of been not closely monitoring, but keeping an eye out on how many people are using it, and it's fairly small, about 10 people a day. Typically, it's just a stroll through, in and out, with kind of one of the key features of stopping to look at the native plant nursery and expressing interest in that area. The Foothills Park Ad Hoc Committee and staff had worked with Grassroots Ecology, the city's restoration stewardship partner, to create this draft plan. And I'm extremely grateful for Grassroots and their graciously sharing their expertise and time to create the draft plan. They did a wonderful job. Grassroots Ecology maintains a native plant nursery on the site and has been conducting restoration in Foothills since 2013. They've engaged with thousands of volunteers to remove invasive species and plant native plants and provide hands-on education for all members of our community. Their staff and volunteers have worked on the 7.7 acre area controlling invasive weeds and installing willow stakes in Buckeye Creek to help with the erosion and to create habitat. They've also experimented with test plots. In anticipation of this day, when we started talking about what to do, we wanted to know what's possible. And so staff had worked with Grassroots to say, let's try some. We know that the soil medium is compromised. There's approximately 5 feet of overburden, which is material that came from the adjacent quarry, and prior to the city taking ownership had been spread across the hillside and the valley floor of the 7.7 acre area. And when we talked to the caretaker, Mr. Arriaga's caretaker, who had done planting on that area, he talked about how challenging it was. And he talked about the trees being difficult to establish, but it was possible when he added lots of compost and mulch. And eventually he was able to establish some trees that did make it. And likewise, we learned from Grassroots' experiments and experiments on that area, and those lessons were incorporated into this draft plan. While this plan does focus on restoration, there are other elements, a very simple loop trail that carries people through this little area, some basic park amenities, a park bench, an interpretive sign, and drinking fountain that are in keeping with the rest of Foothills Park. The plan's broken into phases. And it gets a little complex when we talk about how long each phase would be, because in truth, when we get to restoration, some phases never end. So if we talk about addressing invasive weeds, in truth, that will always be part, just like it is for the rest of Foothills Park. We continually have volunteers go out into the park and address invasive weeds. So I guess the one caveat is don't get too hung up with one specific item in one specific phase, because some of them will just be carrying on indefinitely, if that makes sense. But the game plan would be to start with building on what Grassroots has already been doing, which is controlling the invasive weeds in those areas. We would also propose to remove eucalyptus trees and adding compost and mulch to restoration area A. So that's this area over here. And this is the area, here's Buckeye Creek. Let me really quickly show you just a few of the major features. This is the city's maintenance shop, the entrance to the 7.7 acre area, and a new pollinator garden that Grassroots built. This is the Grassroots Ecology nursery, and the creek flows right through the property and on out of the property. This red line is the emergency evacuation route that we've got to maintain. And then we've created these different habitat areas, restoration areas. So restoration area 1, or phase 1, prepares restoration area A by putting in those soil amendments that we talked about. So this area would get that compost put onto it during that first phase to try to prep it and get it ready, hopefully soften up some of the soil, control some of the weeds, and make for a happier place for these plants that we intend on putting in there and the trees we intend on planting. Other things in phase 1 that we want to do is plant some native plants installed along the perimeter fencing. That's this area to try to screen a little bit. There's already a fairly established tree section in there that the caretaker had planted or was already on site, and we want to supplement that with just a little more shrubs to help screen and provide a little privacy for the neighbors. And then plant some groupings of native trees that would help mitigate that removal of the eucalyptus that we talked about. In addition to that, we would establish those park benches, the interpretive sign, and that trail, a very simple loop trail that you can see highlighted here that just goes around this section. Phase 2, that second phase, we're going to plant native plants in that restoration area. This area here, now it would have about a year or so with that soil amendment in the ground, hopefully softening it up a little bit and preparing it for these plants to come in. Area B then, the next spot, would get the treatment. So we'd put the compost and mulch down there to prep that for the next year's planting, if that makes sense. And so on for area C. We would use acorns, oaks, and shrubs to be planted in little natural groupings, and then do a second phase of eucalyptus removal. I'm going to scroll down to the tree plant plan here. And you can see on this map, we've got the first phase of eucalyptus removal and then the second phase. And we take any tree removal very seriously in Palo Alto. It should never be done, even when it's a non-native tree. It should always be done cautiously and with thought and planning. We recognize even the invasive ones, they do cause harm, and we believe when we talk to our experts at Grassroots Ecology and our Fire Safe Council that we work with on fire hazards, it's best to remove them for a multitude of reasons. Fire safety and environmental benefit is one, but we recognize even invasive trees and plants sometimes serve as habitat, and we want to be sensitive to that. So the key would be to A, phase it, and B, make sure we're planting right away to try to help make up for that. Hopefully that, in addition to all the other native plantings, we'd be supplying a good balance of habitat improvement. Also, in speaking with Grassroots Ecology, they've seen eucalyptus removals from areas like this, very similar, and explained to me that oftentimes when you take out that eucalyptus, you'll see the surrounding vegetation, often native oaks and other species that are under the canopy, thrive and grow and bounce back. And so we're looking forward to that, but they also have some restoration and planting plans up here as well in those gaps where the eucalyptus are removed. And in phase 3, native plants, as particular to pollinators, would be planted in strategic spots to help create a little added beauty and lure in additional pollinators. We could put in additional benches and a picnic table at that time, and then finalize the arrangement of where that trail is. I think we should look at the trail as sort of being a flexible thing depending on how the restoration goes. If the restoration, for some reason, we hit a good patch of soil and the plants are doing great, well then let's move the trail out of that area and we'll put people on the side. We've been thinking of a very simple, either rope to delineate where those sections are, to keep people not trampling the plants, but able to walk right up next to them, but not into those restoration areas is the thought. The next steps, so of course we'll welcome your feedback and questions, but the next step would be for staff to hold that community meeting, meet with our stakeholders and community members, and give them a chance to weigh in on the plan, as well as maybe other ideas that we hadn't considered that may be even better. That concludes the staff presentation, but I want to recognize 2 representatives from Grassroots Ecology. I've got Alex Von Felt, who's the Executive Director, and Kristen Williams, the Habitat Restoration Director, who are here tonight and able to address any specific questions you might have for them.
Oh, welcome visitors. Do you have any comments that you would like to make to add to what Darren has said before we go to questions?
Maybe I'll say a few words. First of all, thank you very much, commissioners, for your time in reviewing this, as well as the other work that you do. And yes, we've had probably this has been at least 4, if not 5 years of discussions with the city and Parks and Rec Commission and also residents about what could happen at the site, and getting lots of opinions and feedback. So it's we're excited that there's actually some movement forward. And the only thing that I would add is that if you were to show us the whole 1,400 acres of Foothills Park and say, where's the one area you want to restore, this would probably not be it, because there's so many other areas of Foothills Park with just amazing native vegetation and biodiversity and things like that. But we understand, just from a usage standpoint, the reason to improve what it looks like right now, which has really been kind of a neglected plot. So what we went for is basically what was a really cost-effective way to try to expand the natural assets of the site, such as the creek, and also use it as a way to showcase some habitat restoration techniques. So we already have the native plant nursery there, and when I ask them too, I say, who's coming by and looking at the site? They say it tends to be elderly people that like to walk on the flat, and they like to stop by and visit with our staff and volunteers working at the nursery. So, kind of building on that we're hoping to have more examples throughout this area to show habitat restoration, different techniques, and also as things progress, hopefully people can see kind of the long-term process of healing our land and what that's like.
Thank you.
May I ask, could you comment really quickly on the point that Darren was discussing on removal of the eucalyptus and the transition period to oaks and other native vegetation?
Sure. So for the reasons that Darren mentioned, eucalyptus are often suggested for removal. Not only is it a fire concern, it's also another safety concern is that they do tend to drop limbs. Kristen just informed me right when we were talking about this that this past few weeks we've seen 2 major limbs drop back there. So it is a concern when you're having volunteers and things like that. What's the safety aspect of it? But for the most part, we're recommending removal because of the habitat value. there are just so many wonderful native species and trees in there, and the eucalyptus, what happens is, it's not really a shading issue, it's that they drop all this debris and leaves, and they have a allelopathy, is that correct? I'll look at Kristen, because she's a little more expert there than I am, but it actually kills other plants. So once you remove them, you actually just, everything that has been struggling can really come back quite strongly. And it's not just our opinion about that, it's a generally accepted restoration practice. The San Francisco Estuary Institute has really been promoting more oaks in Silicon Valley, and they keep talking about re-oaking, like planting new oaks. And what's nice here is there's so many other really strong ones that we think once the eucalyptus is removed, you're gonna see an amazing, the growth of those trees.
Before I go to the rest of the commission, I do have a card on this topic. Shawnee, would you like to comment, please?
Thank you. Shani Kleinhaus with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society and resident. First, I want to thank you, staff, for keeping low-key and not looking to put campgrounds and barbecues and dog parks and all these other things near the creek in such a sensitive area. And I hope that the community, which supported low-key and not a lot of really strong, active crowd attracting and noise and so on, will remain this way. About the trees, I want to look more into that before I speak about it, because eucalyptus does have value for birds and specific species as well. So I'm going to look a little more into that before I form an opinion about this issue. But it would be something we'll probably come back to. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start at the other end. Jeff, or who were the ad hoc members who have worked on this? Jeff and Ryan, right? And I'll let you guys speak first then, please.
Well, thank you to Darren and the staff for preparing this, and Grassroots Ecology. It's can be such a great space, and the mention of it being flat and how we have this great nature area of Foothills Park, but not everything is accessible to everyone. And so, one of the things that we did talk about on the trail, we're putting some benches, which also seems to go with some of the theme that we've talked about in terms of mobility and accessibility. And so I think to have that is a very good idea. To see the explanation on the eucalyptus trees was also very helpful, as we are sensitive to the habitat removal as well as removal of trees, but to know that how that might be able to, other oaks and other native species can come in there is exciting as well. But excited to see this plan, if we can get it through, and the restoration and the increased use of that area is very exciting. So, Darren, thank you very much.
Ryan?
I will echo Jeff's comments. Darren, thank you for spearheading this, and thank you to our partners at Grassroots Ecology. Well done. Let me make one quick clarification. I think it's a clarification on the Buckeye Creek hydrology study, which is really just to remind everyone that there definitely is a recommended course of action to do some additional remediation of the creek in this area. But as Darren was saying, number one, this plan I think is consistent with the Buckeye Creek hydrology recommendation. But in addition to that, as you think about the bang for the buck in doing any of the work on Buckeye Creek, the most significant impact is going to be on the upper reach of Buckeye Creek, and probably the least significant impact is going to be on this portion of Buckeye Creek. So I think it makes total sense to move forward with a plan of the sort that Darren and Grassroots Ecology have come up with here. I think it makes a lot of sense that this be something we put into action.
Keith?
Yeah, thank you. It was a good report. Thank you for the help. We appreciate that. With regard to the eucalyptus removal, can we front load the tree planting and get them started now, and when we eventually remove the trees, at least we have something there?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Are we planning to do that, or is that?
It's actually in the, I think it's in the plan itself. It talks about the need to start right away.
Okay, very good. Alex mentioned the areas needing restoration, and that there'd be other places in the park. Can you name those off the top of your head, or?
Well, I might be passing this on to Kristen because she's been overseeing what we've been doing at the park there, but I mean, the biodiversity is quite phenomenal there, and there's a listed species, Durca occidentalis, and then there are some invasive species like yellow star thistle that threaten the habitat. And so, as you probably know, the Friends of Foothill have been working for decades on that, and then we've been augmenting their help. And so, you know, that is really, when we're talking about stewarding the whole park, that's where we spend a lot of our time to remove the invasives and allow natural recruitment. And so we were thinking, you know, that's just sort of, if you want to keep getting volunteers out and really have a habitat effect, that would probably be the best. But there's a lot of reasons why you do projects like this, and a lot of it too is to make sure that the community is able to engage with nature in a meaningful way so that they're more activated to protect it. So I think this project is still in line with that goal.
Yeah, but your areas of restoration is mostly invasive weed species taken out. Was there any erosion areas or anything, plantings where we would want to put things?
Well, that was, you know, this Buckeye Creek idea, we are fully behind, and I think, you know, we started talking with Darren about it years ago, because that's what we see as really the big restoration impact that you could have there, because right now the creek is so channelized, so if you could actually reconnect it to its historic floodplain, that would be amazing. So we really support that, but it is a long and very expensive project. So we realize that that's what would be great to have in the future, but it's nice to have these interim steps along the way.
Okay, thank you. So Darren, with regard to restoration, do we keep like a wish list of places that if we had money, whether in any of the open spaces, that we would do restoration first and rank them?
Yes, and there are, I should qualify this, that we've got sort of a list that are achievable with existing resources. So we address that with our operating budget as it is, with our capital budget as it is, and with our volunteer base as it is. So that partnership with Grassroots is an excellent one. We've done amazing work at restoring large areas of Pearson-Arastadero Preserve and Foothills Park. We're talking 25 years of the Friends of Foothills Park working up there and restoring. And so we prioritize spots, and along with staff, those volunteers have made good headway. I would say the same at the Baylands. We've had 20 years of partnership with Save the Bay and restored significant sections of San Francisco Creek and other areas in the Baylands. So there's that kind, and we prioritize areas. And there's a bigger kind, like the new ITT marsh area. So that's not going to be done or restored without a big capital endeavor. I think Buckeye Creek falls into that same category. I think those two stand out really, really high as important areas. Another one at the Baylands are identified in the Baylands master plan. And these are fill areas that were filled when they first established the park. And they are called out as areas that the fill should be removed and be restored. One of those sites is where we want to put the horizontal levee. So it essentially meets that. So those are three examples of those large capital expenditure waiting projects that I think are really important and just waiting for the funding source.
Okay, thank you. The willows, I like that idea of planting the willows in the streams. Like 200 years ago, would the stream had willows in it, or?
Yes, very, very commonly.
And what about upper and middle? Would we consider planting willows there at all? Would that be useful at all?
Yeah, I think luckily the Buckeye Creek study gave us a good recommendation for, well, the upper stretch, they talk about rerouting it, right? So we put it through that meadow, and in that area they call out a bunch of techniques, one of which is to plant some native trees that would help slow the water and create more natural flow.
Oh, so the Buckeye Creek plan did have some willows in it? Or some, okay, I do not remember that. Yeah, that I think would be good both for habitat and also slowing down the water. I think it's a win-win. Yeah, that's it. Okay, thank you.
David?
This is a really terrific plan, because when you look at the whole thing, it seems daunting. But when you break it up into smaller pieces, each one somewhat manageable, also that lower cost to deal with, so you don't have these huge projects like Buckeye Creek. You can bite off a little bit of, every year. That, I think, is a great way to go. One thing I was trying to figure out is, and maybe this is a question for you or for Grassroots, is the existing Buckeye Creek channel is very narrow, and is there a plan or a suggestion to widen it like we were thinking of doing for Buckeye Creek? In other words, get some of the benefit of the Buckeye Creek project, which is $9 million, do it here. Widen it out, take a little bit less, a little bit of those other two areas, and sort of get some of the benefit short term.
Yes, great question. And as I mentioned, there were 3 spots recommended in the Buckeye Creek study. This was the third, the least impactful, but it sort of, if you went from the, the creek's edge, it created a widened floodplain that stretches out into this restoration area here, which is why in our plan we don't call for planting any trees in that spot. So that if that day came where we said, hey, we want to remove, so what that looks like is at the base of the creek, you would remove fill and widen out the floodplain, as you're talking about. That, we have a price estimate, I want to say it was like 1.2 million to do the 7.7 acre stretch. So what we're proposing is in the third phase, the last phase, we would eventually plant that area too. And if the plants had to go at some time, if we try the Upper Creek technique and for some reason it's not successful and we have to do the middle and perhaps the lower stretch to really resolve the Buckeye Creek problems, all you'd have to do is get rid of some native plants. We wouldn't have oaks there, that kind of thing. If we didn't do anything at all, you'd still have plants there. It would just be grown in with weeds. So I think all the better to have viable habitat in the interim. And it may not even be necessary once we address that upper stretch.
Okay. I guess what I was just suggesting is that maybe you think of phase 3 as phase 1. You know, switch them just for short-term benefit. I don't know if that's possible, but just something to think about. And one other thing is that the soil, you said, was of such a consistency that the water would not pool very easily there. It would sink pretty quickly. And so are you thinking that you would want, in order to get willows, for instance, it has to be wetter and it has to be cooler. And so you would have to do something to the soil to make it stay wetter longer. And so I was wondering what would you do in that case?
Yeah, I probably didn't explain myself well. The majority of that is of the 7.7 acres is highly compacted overburden. And so it doesn't percolate well at all. So the water would pool and it wouldn't absorb or soak in. The intent of that mulch and compost would be to break down that soil and allow a little bit more penetration. The willow planting would primarily be in the creek and on the banks of the creek, where it does have access to water and do well.
Alex, do you have a comment you'd like to make?
Sure. First of all, the first comment you had about doing phase 3 first, actually, I asked the same thing. I thought, well, let's just start down here if this is where the interest is. But then other people with more expertise informed me that you typically want to start at the top of the watershed and then go down because of the head cuts and things, that you could do some stuff down below, but it really wouldn't fix the problem because you still have this constraint above. So that was what the hydrologists said. But I'm going to actually ask Kristen to come up and talk about the willowing that we've been doing in the creek for the past few years and some of the amazing things we've actually seen just in the current incised part of the creek on this site.
So we actually started doing some willow installation this past winter in the 7.7. So we did a mix of willow stakes as well as willow bundles to help kind of catch sediment as it's either coming down the creek bank or down the creek. And we actually, it's a lot more successful than we even expected, which is really exciting. We have probably about 20 to 30 feet along the creek that now has willows that are about like 3 to 4 feet tall in them, and they are collecting a lot of sediment already. So it is, it's not a huge change to the floodplain area, but it is having some impact already. And so kind of like how our nursery was doing test plots in the upland area, we're also doing this little testing closer to the creek. And so we're figuring out what's the right technique once we really put this project into play.
Thank you. David, do you have anything else? Ann?
Thank you very much, Darren. Thank you for this report and the staff, and thank you all from Grassroots. And it was really fun to see the excitement about what's going on down there, so thank you for that. Had a couple of questions about the benches, because it sounds like we need to publicize the fact that people can make a donation on behalf of their family for benches, both in the parks and also up at Foothills. So maybe we could kind of resurface that. And then I love the phasing, but are you able at this point, Darren, to put a price tag? Sort of where does this money come from to do this, and how is it parceled out over the years?
Yeah, good question. Not yet. We started preliminary to look at a price estimate, and I thought, let's do the public outreach first and find out a little bit more of what the scope really might look like. Sometimes through that process, it alters so much that what I originally proposed doesn't always look the same. So I figured we'd do the public outreach and then start digging into this. However, we're keeping an eye on trying to keep the costs modest, working a lot with volunteers. For example, that compost and mulch might very well come from city resources. So all the compost all the mulch we need would come from the tree department for free, for example. And we've got a great partner that has a native plant nursery, and we can work together to get the plants and try to do this as cost effective as possible. That said, depending on how it shapes out, it might be a CIP request for a certain amount. I think we'll just kind of play it by ear, and as the scope develops, put together a meaningful cost estimate and share it with you at that time.
Great, thank you so much.
Councilmember Cormack?
Thank you, Chair McDougall. I always love a staff report I learn a new word in, and allelopathic was one I had to look up earlier today. So, you always learn so much about trees. Side note, if you haven't read The Overstory, I do recommend that by Richard Powers. The only point I just wanted to emphasize was the one that Commissioner Lemire made about accessibility, and I think it was introduced by the executive director as well. Am I right that this is the only part of Foothills Park that's really flat in terms of a trail?
I think that's fair to say.
So I think that's an important reason to make it accessible for our increasing senior population and for, frankly, the significant number of people in the community who have temporary or permanent mobility disabilities. So I think that's a benefit of working on this area that I probably didn't appreciate, when we first started talking about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to say is, thank you for Alex, and I'm sorry I missed your partner's name. Kristen, thank you for being here, and the fact that you guys tend to agree that something could grow there. I think every time I've been there on any of our things, all I got was there's 5 feet of overburden here, and there's nothing ever is going to grow here. And some of those squared off plots didn't look like, it looked like it was proving that nothing was going to grow there. So I'm glad to hear you're optimistic, and I think that's great. The thing we do say, and the thing I've been hearing all along, is we're saying native plants. With climate change and whatnot, we know that where native plants are is moving, and I would really be interested if we looked at this as climate sensitive or climate appropriate or whatever. What we do there doesn't have to be absolutely native if there's something that's better. Number one. Number two, the railings that you talked about, I would really, really encourage that. And you've been talking about the trails and the fact that that's a flat area. I suggest we start now talking about it being an ADA trail. And that instead of just talking about, as this map shows, the trail going around the 7.7 acres, the parking is the other side of the construction sheds. So I would say that the trail needs to be planned right from the start to be an ADA trail that goes from the parking lot as part of the whole process, because it's no good you can't get to the trail. I would really like to encourage that, there was some conversation, Alex, you said about showcasing habitat and whatever, and at some level, this is a research opportunity to see what's going on. I would really encourage that we do everything we possibly can to establish what the baseline is today. In terms of if this is going to be good for habitat, are there 6 birds there today, and pretty soon, if we do this right, we'll have 12, or, are there deer there, or are there, or what kind of plants are there or not there? I think really, really working between what you do and what the city does to establish a baseline so that we would understand, are we really making an improvement? And particularly relative to even the eucalyptus, I hate eucalyptus, but they're there, and maybe they don't need to be removed in all of those spots. I was struck not by this map, but the other one that showed where the eucalyptus were, that they were circled in different areas, and it seemed to me that it might be an opportunity to, in one case, maybe divide that off, and that some of the eucalyptus might be left, and we could measure what happens there and versus what happens where we take them out. And particularly if we're looking at the opportunity to show what restoration can be, anything we can do to say, look, we took these trees out, and now look what's happening. Overnight we have a 20-foot oak tree that we didn't have before, or something like that. But just simply making sure that we understand that. I'm struck by the number of times that volunteers get mentioned. We've had this conversation before briefly relative to other activities. I kind of doubt that if I looked at the Palo Alto recreation catalog, that one of the potential recreation opportunities is to volunteer for 7.7 acres or any other part of Foothill or whatever. My guess is there's lots more clever ways that we're not taking advantage of. And we've had this conversation about, does the city need a volunteer coordinator? Or even Parks and Rec, do they deliberately need somebody maybe not totally dedicated to it, but actively interested in promoting volunteers? The benches, I don't know if it's in the Parks and Regulation part or whatever. I did get stopped on Bixby the other day, and somebody who has I guess you get a 10-year lease on a benching naming or whatever. And the question is, at the end of the 10 years, are you going to give me a new bench, or are you going to charge me again? Even though the bench is now deteriorated, will I get a new plaque? Or, it was a reasonable question, and I certainly don't know the answer. I don't even know where I could find the answer. It would seem to me that maybe in Parks and in the regulations might be a place to look for that. And the other thing is, although I've said let's make sure it's an ADA trail that goes through there, I would still be interested in the previous conversation. Was there a way, even if it was just a tail, to connect to at least one of the other paths in the park? And that's my rant for the moment on that subject. Ann?
Could I just ask, is there a comprehensive list of all the volunteers who do all this wonderful stuff?
We do track all our volunteer hours.
So, but not the hours, but the names of people?
Of every volunteer?
Yeah, that are associated with all the Friends of the this and the Friends of the that and Grassroots and all of that?
Oh, our friends, yes, we do have all that.
So maybe I don't know this, but wouldn't it be fun for the Recreation Commission to have a big party to get everybody together and say thank you very much for everything that you do?
Great idea.
Sounds good. I'll reach out to the groups.
And just a few points of data that you might be interested to know about the volunteers. I was just checking with Kristen, and I said, how often are our volunteer workdays full? She said 90 to 100% of the time. And
Wow.
we have at least 30 workdays per year already at Foothills, and we have another 75 workdays at Adaro. And about 80% of the people that come to the workdays are teens, so they're not in the city parks. I guess they're all out pulling weeds in the open spaces. So it's great that we have so many people. So I would think if a volunteer appreciation party would be lovely. You'd probably, the list of names would be about 3,000 or so from like our side, but a lot of them are teenagers. So from a repeat, Friends of Foothill, and we have dedicated volunteers as well, both at the nursery and other places, then that's a smaller number.
Yeah. I mean, that would be a great celebration and great focus on how much we have from volunteers.
Sounds good.
I agree.
Chairman McDougall reminded me that just 3 weeks ago, Mid-Peninsula Open Space opened their brand-new Bear Creek Open Space Preserve, and they completed an ADA compliant pathway at the entrance. It's about the 7.5 acres that we're dealing with, and I encourage staff and the subcommittee to go visit it. It's a beautiful park, and it's just brand new.
Excellent, thank you.
Are there any other additional questions or comments? I see lights on, but I suspect that lights on doesn't mean anything. Alex or Kristen, would you like to add any final comments? Or I would just like to thank you both very much for coming and spending the time with us and answering the questions and giving us confidence that we're doing the right thing here. And Darren, thanks again for everything you're doing here. Which allows us to move on to the next item, item number 4, which is the open space and parks regulation discussion.
Hello, Commissioners. Darren Anderson again, Community Services, here now to discuss the updates to the park and open space regulations. The Commission Ad Hoc Committee and staff have reviewed the regulations and recommend the Commission discuss the proposed changes that were in the staff report and the attachment. And the changes are suggested in order to keep the regulations relevant and reflective of current city policies. Some of the revisions are new regulations to address emerging issues, edits designed to make the regulations a little easier to understand, references to the municipal code to show the connection between the regulations and the Muni Code, and wording changes to reflect that current city policy. In the staff report, I highlighted several of the significant changes, and some of the updates are self-evident and explanatory, but a few of them I'd like to go over now and explain just a little bit of the context. And of course, if you have any questions along the way, we'll revisit any and all of them. The first one I'd like to highlight is R121. And this is the one about commercial photography and filming. And this was edited to allow an exception for small photo and film events consisting of a single photographer or videographer with a group size of no more than 24. And the intent of this edit was to allow small photo or film activity that would have little or no impact on park visitors or park resources to be able to come to the park and take those photos. I did receive some feedback from one community member with some suggested edits to this regulation, and I believe that this gentleman sent an email to the commission, so you probably have seen some of the suggested edits to that. With a few minor edits, the Ad Hoc Committee and staff have reviewed his proposed change and find it acceptable. Look forward to hearing your feedback on that. Another regulation that was updated is R130D. This one's about pets in parks, and this was edited to require that pets must be kept on a leash that it can be extended no further than 6 feet while in open space lands. The reason for this one is park rangers have observed people with the long extended leashes where oftentimes dogs are going way off trail into areas where there are habitat, where there are wildlife, and you can see the wildlife get flushed out, and it's been an issue. We didn't feel it was necessary to do this in our urban parks. Notably, this just pertains to open space, and we thought in urban parks it is far more appropriate and less problematic. R131, this one is about nuisance dogs, was added to require people with leashed pets in playgrounds to ensure that their pets don't impact children's use of the playground, and adding a caveat that they're required to remove the dog if someone else is using the playground and asks them to. And the reason we've edited this one is because park staff has received requests from playground users to prohibit dogs in the playground. And this edit is trying to balance the need for people who come to a playground with their child and their dog, and maybe there are very few people in there and the dog causes no problem. They want to use both the dog and the child to be in the playground, with folks who just don't want to be around dogs in playgrounds. That's an attempt to balance it, and the ad hoc was very helpful in trying to reach this compromise position. R139 was added to ensure people using exercise equipment in playgrounds do not inhibit children from using the playgrounds or damage the equipment. And the reason for this one is we're increasingly seeing our playgrounds in parks used as gyms. And we talked a little bit earlier about how active our community is in our park system, which is wonderful and something we want to encourage, but we want to make sure it doesn't impinge on children using playgrounds or harm the equipment. So oftentimes people are working out with dumbbells or straps and they're slung over swings. And so R139 was an attempt to balance that without stopping people from being active. R140 was the one that pertained to community gardens, and the vast majority of the bullet points in R140 were just merely about details of how the garden program functions. And the ad hoc and staff have created the draft of a new document, the Community Garden Guidelines, that will house those kind of details about how the program works. These guidelines would be sent to all participants in the city community garden program, as well as be part of the licensing process. So they would all get essentially these guidelines as they join the program. They're currently being reviewed by the city attorney's office and will come to the commission for their review soon. The remaining community garden regulations that end up in this update do pertain to the general public and are far more appropriate for this one. And that concludes the staff presentation. And thanks again to the ad hoc who were so helpful in looking at this one, so many iterations.
Would ad hoc members like to speak first?
Happily. Thank you to Darren for his patience. We definitely looked at many, many iterations, and I think that where we've ended up with this document is actually a pretty good place. Don, I would wonder whether you had some specific comments, and one of them I think is a big sort of organizational threshold question, and I think it maybe would be beneficial if you wanted to pose that so that Darren would be able to respond, and it might actually inform the conversation a little bit. I definitely look forward to the commissioner's input on this and letting us know if there's other things that we should be tweaking and revising. As a general matter, the idea was not to, wholesale revise these regulations, but rather, do a fairly modest revision of things that needed some attention. But Don had suggested an organizational change, which may not be necessarily substantive in some respects, but definitely an organizational change that would be more significant of a revision. So, Don, do you maybe want to mention that, and then other commissioners would be able to weigh in on it as we continue the discussion?
Is that okay, Darren? So my reading of this, I went through and sent a bunch of notes back, more in the comprehensive plan approach than going through a list here. And before I start, I'd like to say I really thank you, both you and the ad hoc, for I think what is really good work. But I found that many places it was sort of confusing whether I was talking about dog parks or cattle or foothills or open parks, and really felt that it might be useful if, in fact, there were two documents, one that dealt with the open space and both foothills and Baylands, and one that dealt with the parks. I feel that the users and the use cases are quite different, and that the kind of people that go to those places are different. I think the documents become such that if somebody wanted to object to somebody with dumbbells in the park, it would be very hard to find that maybe an officer could find it, or maybe we could find it, but a general user wouldn't, general citizen wouldn't. I briefly discussed that in the note that I sent. I did discuss it again with Darren as he walked in. Darren's modification to that, I might as well mention, is maybe we could look at this as one document, but with a general section and then a parks section and then a foothills section in some way that outlined it more briefly. And I agree this isn't substantive relative to any of the particular rules and regulations. I think it is important relative to the usability of the rules and regulations. Does that cover it? Is there anybody else on the ad hoc who would like to comment? And by the way, I appreciate that the goal here was not to do it was to update it, not to totally redo it. I would point out that this document was written in 2004, modified in 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 12, and 13. So basically every other year or every year it has been modified until between 13 to 18, for 5 years it wasn't looked at. And then, so the other thing I would encourage is that maybe it does deserve a more complete look and some commitment that it not be another 5 years before it gets looked at again. I might as well say my other thing is, if we're having discussions about access to parks, and if we're having discussion about dog parks and other things like that, it would be much easier to deal with all of those things in separate sections rather than, and the modifications that might ensue, rather than in a single total document. With that, I'll start back on the far end. Jeff, do you have any comments?
Thank you so much, both to the Ad Hoc Committee and Darren, for looking at these rules and regulations and providing an update. Quick question. As you went through this, were there things you were able to pick up that may change the way we look at the parks or change what is in the parks? One thing I'm looking at is R139, for example. And does this mean that we need to look at, this is about people using the exercise equipment in the playgrounds. But should we start thinking about, well, can we put a separate pull-up bar in that can also be used to throw their TRX straps over it, that they can do, use what they want to use and make it more multi-use, where it's not necessarily impacting the children, but also seeing that, wait, we do have a need.
I think that's an excellent point and something we have been talking about. We're addressing it, for example, at Cubberley. With that track and field, we're trying to put in a place for adult exercise or multi-generational exercise where you'd have gym equipment there. And I envision that being extremely popular. I've seen other communities with those kind of outdoor gyms, and I see seniors active, I see kids active, and I see exercise groups there. I think it has a lot of potential. To your other point, though, of at a given, we can't have those everywhere. We don't have space for that kind of thing everywhere. So it needs to be perhaps incorporated in those playgrounds where we see that happening. And we tried that at the Magical Bridge, for example, where right on the periphery of the playground, you'll see adult exercise equipment like aerobic exercise, for example. But I think you're right that maybe we need to start addressing, if we see people using the swing set for the TRX cables, then maybe they need an appropriate piece of equipment to do that in that area. I think it's wise.
Thank you.
Ryan?
Forgive me, I'm going to jump in again. So, Darren, I was wondering if you had a response to Don's comment that you wanted to share with the entire commission. Sure. On that topic of separating the parks from the open space regulations, where I can certainly see what you mean, Chair McDougall, that's organizationally, there's an opportunity maybe to group them up. In my opinion, it just seems that the overlap is so significant, it warrants having one document to me. I also, and maybe I'm naive, but I'm one of those people who sees the people who are going to go to the open space are probably going to be at a park eventually too, and vice versa, and having knowledge about what the rules are to there would behoove them, and have one place to go. I worry sometimes about having split documents. Somehow they get confused and can't find the open space one, they can only find the parks one.
And lastly, I think it's consistent with the way we have structured our Palo Alto Municipal Code. We have Section 22 of the Palo Alto Municipal Code that has all our muni codes relating to parks and open space, and it's housed in one area, so it would be consistent with that. That was my thoughts on the separating out of the two sections.
And so I will offer one other thought on this, which is that just as a practical matter, in terms of trying to track what the changes are that are being made, if we're dramatically changing the organization, I think it would be a little more difficult to understand and comprehend just what we're doing in terms of edits. And then the other flip side of that, I think, is that it may make it more difficult for the city council to comprehend and understand what we've done here. Right now, these look like, at least from my perspective, relatively modest edits, but if we were to entirely rewrite this, even if we didn't change the substance much, but reorganize it significantly, I think that understandably, both members of the public and the city council members might have a lot more questions about it, for whatever that's worth. Not to say that it shouldn't be done if it's the right thing to be done, and I'm sure the ad hoc would be excited to jump into that, but we look forward to the rest of the group's direction on that.
I'd like to thank the ad hoc. This was a very tedious edit, I'm sure. So I appreciate you going through here with a fine-tooth comb. That's a lot of work, but it has to be done. Echoing Jeff's comment, it's always, you get better compliance if you, instead of saying don't do this, you say instead do it here. So I agree with that. I had two questions. On the swimming part, it said dogs and cats and other animals not permitted on the pool deck, but we don't have an exception for service dogs. Was that intentional?
That might be an omission. Likewise, Chair McDougall caught one on our restrooms and who could be there with children with special needs, and he questioned whether that should be updated. I think it should. It didn't rise to my attention as we reviewed the document, and maybe the one you just mentioned about service dogs, maybe too. I'd be glad to look into it.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume that we're not get a lot of service dogs in the pool deck, but I could see it. It's conceivable, so we should just be consistent. The other thing was about Lytton Plaza and the open flames. Can you refresh my memory? What is the regulation both in city parks and open space for gas grills? If I want to bring my Weber to the park, if I have a picnic area, can I bring my own gas grill and put it in there, or can you only use the built-in grills?
We've got a no portable barbecue rule that was instituted in the parks. It was because of what happens when people bring their own barbecues is all the other amenities that need to come with a barbecue, like tables, chairs, trash cans, recycling, and compost, aren't there to support it because other people are already using the existing tables and barbecues that have the right number of trash cans. And so that's why that rule got put in, prohibiting that.
And same with Foothills Park. Right?
That's correct.
Foothills Park, you can only use charcoal, right?
That's correct.
No wood.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Again, forgive me for jumping in. We actually had a
Sure,
little
Ryan,
bit
is there anything you'd like to say?
We actually had a little bit of back and forth on the portable grill question, and my understanding is that propane grills are actually preferred most often, particularly in open space areas, because they pose a far lower fire hazard than charcoal. Notwithstanding that, this is not being changed at the moment, but this is something that I think Darren was checking with his partners at the fire department on. And Darren, was there any further feedback on that?
The one part I didn't explain is it is allowed with camping. So they are allowed to use the propane grills when they're camping, but not for picnics. And again, it ties back into that issue of are they going to exceed the capacity of our existing facilities? But I'd be glad to reach out to them and talk to the fire department about that option and see what other alternatives we can work out.
Yeah, I mean, from a fire standpoint, you might want to consider allowing gas grills at Foothills Park if it can be done some way where we don't stretch the facilities. I don't know.
David?
So what is the process after these rules get updated? How do people know about them? And What kind of community outreach, is that necessary? Just as the changes happen.
Yeah, very good question. So this would be a recommendation from the commission to council to make the change. In terms of publicizing it, we don't do a lot of outreach. The typical way it's done is for a special event or maybe a user group was having some sort of gatherings, we'll send them, this is the revised and updated rules and regulations.
I see.
And oftentimes we'll pull out salient pieces. If you're having a run event, maybe I'll find 2 or 3 that are really important for them to be aware of. And if there's a new one, of course, I'll add that to it. So that's the predominant way. But our website and every once in a while we'll get calls from folks, and that's when we share.
And then how does the enforcement, if at all, happen? How does complaints?
So there's 2 ways. One is the municipal code, which has a lot of these, but not all of them. And that has a mechanism for citations. And the rules and regs also have it, but typically at a far lower rate. So the bail amount that you get cited for a regulation violation is less.
I see.
It's not very frequently cited. Most of these are the kind of thing where, for example, if we, trying to think of a good one, although not a current regulation now, if we saw people with leashes and they're harassing wildlife, which is a separate regulation violation, the municipal code violation, I was a ranger for over a decade, and I don't think I cited a single person for it. Everyone was usually compliant. So it's almost always compliant-based, but for those who are repeat offenders, it's very nice to have the tool to write a citation if you need to.
Okay, thank you. And then one more question. The King Plaza has no alcohol allowed, is that right?
I'd have to double check. I don't have it handy, but I can get back to you on that.
So a little history on that is that many years ago, we had a concert series on the plaza that was the Friday night series. It served wine and beer, and we staff didn't realize that we needed to have a special something or other, so there was an ordinance passed that we could do alcohol on King Plaza. So anyhow, it got probably changed around, but that was a gathering place kind of thing, Don.
Always an attractive way to arrange a gathering, and to make a gathering civil, of course. Jeff, would you like to make any comments?
Hi, I'm Jeff Conrad. I'm from Palo Alto. Maybe I should start here by saying that if you people have read my email, I think it covers everything that I would have to say. So if it's clearly conveyed in there, I just as soon save everybody's time and not repeat it. But if you wish, I'd also be glad to make a few comments here.
Jeff, I think I certainly, and I know that Darren has read the email, and I know the ad hoc has, and I believe that they've actually made some suggestions, some modifications to the regulation as it was originally drafted based on your comments. So we appreciate that very much, and we also appreciate your willingness not to repeat them here, so thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for getting involved in the process. We really appreciate that kind of participation.
I don't apologize for missing it in 2004. If I knew there was such a thing as administrative regulations, I'd have commented, but I didn't.
So I have no real additional comments except to thank Darren and the ad hoc. My proposal, by the way, is not to do anything different than what you've currently done with this particular iteration. I do think, and I would have left it alone, except the use case that you just responded to Ann with, which is how people find out about the regulation is they're going to do something in a park or they're going to do something in the foothills, and then you send them the document or whatever. Now they have to go through the whole document to find the relevant piece. I really like the idea that there's one document, but maybe there's 2 separate headings where particularly relevant things to both specific to the open space or specific to the parks can be pulled out. I know dogs are mentioned at least 3 different places. it would be much easier if it was called, it was easy to find the dog park. So I'm not proposing that this ad hoc or this iteration. I am proposing that we should encourage that it not be another 5 years, and the next iteration might benefit from restructure. And I'll give Councilmember Cormack an opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson, I'm just curious if you would characterize the proposed changes as minor, moderate, or major?
Relative to the previous changes where they were really specific to, maybe it was a dog park change, so it was just 1 or 2, I would say this is moderate compared to the previous ones I've been involved with.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
So with that, I think we've completed that discussion. I am going to suggest a slight change in the agenda, if everybody would agree. Number 7 on here is the hike to the sea attachment, and I'd like to give David a few minutes to comment on that at this point before we get into the rest of the ad hoc, unless anybody's got any major objections. David?
On August 14th, the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District Board of Directors had a very unusual meeting that I was allowed to be part of, and I did not represent the city of Palo Alto, but I did talk about the inspiration of the Parks Master Plan to finding routes from our open spaces to other open spaces, other regional trails from Palo Alto to the sea. And it was very well received, but the amazing thing was the meeting itself. There were 7 other organizations that had something to do with regional trails through Mid-Peninsula open space lands. But what was amazing is that many of them touched Palo Alto, and that was not lost on the board, nor was it lost on the other participants. So, for instance, one of the partners was San Francisco Bay Trail, which certainly runs through our Baylands, and they have major changes that they're making. The Bay Area Ridge Trail, which we connect to from at the top, and the SFPUC and the Dumbarton Rail Corridor, which are going to be integral to moving people and commuters and recreational bike riders and walkers from Dumbarton Bridge and from all points north to all points south. So they are doing major changes. And then they also talked about San Mateo County Parks is creating the Ohlone Portola Historical Trail, which ends up at El Palo Alto, which I didn't know. And it's going to span all the way north, almost to San Mateo. So all of these parks, these regional trails, touch Palo Alto in some way. And they were very receptive to changing their priorities to help this Palo Alto to the Sea Trail, because they have one major project that they need to do with the Cloverdale Ranch, which is at the very end of the trail, that they would like to move up to allow this regional trail to be more useful. So that's all I really want to say right now, but it was very well received.
I do want to say that in the planning meeting we had for this meeting, when we talked about it, Commissioner Greenfield, who went to the meeting with you, was extremely complimentary about the presentation that you did, the reaction you got. So although you weren't representing the city, as you say, I think you did do a good job of representing the city. So, thank you very much. I don't know if anybody has any particular questions for David on that. With that, I'd like to go to the Ad Hoc Committee update. I think this month we've had an extremely good job of people submitting all of the reports, so we don't have to go through it in great detail. Personally, part of my reaction to looking at this whole list is the 10.5 acres. It sounds to me like sometime in the next couple of months we might want to bring that forward as from the ad hoc to the full commission. The Foothills Park access, there's obviously work going on that, and that's sort of a continuing update. I don't know if David wanted to comment on his memo, or if Ryan, you wanted to make a comment.
I'll comment very briefly, which is just to say that we've got, I think, a pretty solid draft ready. I met with Jeff Greenfield yesterday, and I think we're anticipating that it will be back before the commission in September for discussion and further public input, and then based on that discussion, that there would be an action item sometime later in the fall for the commission to consider.
I did see in some of the correspondence relative to the agenda, Darren, that Kathleen is now starting to collect information on how many rolls of toilet paper are used, so that, and various other ways of indirectly measuring the use of the park. I would encourage other commission members to, think of things that ought to be measured. I think too often we don't think of what we want to measure. Same with the 7.7 acres. How will we know when we've had success or we've had failure? One thing that wasn't on that list was any kind of incident report. Was there an encounter with a guest or a visitor who had a problem or an issue? Or I think we need to make sure we're recording that too, because that could be one of the things that becomes, as it was noted, one of the potential issues is safety. And if we're not recording that now, then we won't have a benchmark for it. Is there any other comments on any of the ad hocs, David?
I have several comments. So going back to the one about Foothills Park, I will not be at the meeting in September. And so without violating the Brown Act, is there some way that you would give me feedback on some of the items that I mentioned in the memo that I sent afterwards, things that may or may not jive with what you're planning to do? I don't know how to address that. Was there anything that was particularly an issue? Primarily to do with limits, primarily to do with student groups, primarily to do with volunteer groups, primarily to do with barbecues in the wrong place, and fire protection and maintenance with a larger volume of people.
Yeah, so I'll just say that the draft that we have, I think, is fairly detailed, and I think it will probably answer a lot of the questions. So without going into too much detail about what that draft is, I think that your comments are consistent with that draft generally. So I think that we're, incorporating that feedback.
Is it fair to say that you have a different draft today than the one that was sort of floated at the last meeting, and so there is potential update from what Commissioner Moss would have referred to?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. No, the draft is much more detailed. Previously it was sort of a menu of options. Now it's one particular proposal.
I had a comment about the Baylands Comprehensive Conservation Plan. I mentioned earlier that they are reviewing the horizontal levee project this coming Friday, and that will be a very important impact on the Baylands and the city. So I will be coming up with a response after I've seen that presentation. But that has to do with a smooth levee from, not a sheer drop-off, but a smooth transition, no matter what the level of the sea level rise is. It'll still be a smooth transition.
When you say presentation, you mean the tour that's being offered, yeah?
That's right, a tour.
Good.
And then, and one other thing on that is that Darren and I have talked about with Councilman Greenfield about with all of the projects being worked on north of us by SFPUC and the Dumbarton Rail Project, and also the Ravenswood Open Space District working on the San Francisco Bay Trail, that there will be increased pressure on Palo Alto to make improvements on our portion of the Bay Trail north of the Baylands in the what's called the Faber-Laumeister tract. Right now, there's one intransigent landowner who the city is trying to work with to allow us to make improvements to that trail, and it's not going well. So hopefully you can continue to push forward with that, but that is an open issue.
I think we can ask that in a future staff report that we get an update on that. I think, would that be fair?
Yeah, I think so. We'll just have to be cautious that it doesn't turn into an agendized kind of discussion.
Right, that's why I'm suggesting a future staff report. If there are no other comments.
I have.
David?
One other thing, I'm so excited about the pickleball court main development, and also the tremendous response that the city had to the pickleball community to move them during this fairly long break in the action. It's at least 6 to 8 weeks, something like that, and you were able to move them to another part of Mitchell Park. And I think some of the tennis players who were there are moving over to Coverly. I'm not sure how that worked, but I thank you so much for accommodating that very large and very vocal community during this upheaval. And then, and one other thing about the pickleball is I don't think that they contribute a dime to the city for anything we're doing for them, and I'm a little concerned about that. And I wonder if we're able to charge fees to groups to help with maintenance and some of these upgrades. This is coming out of CIP, I think. No, I think it's coming out of maintenance.
CIP funding to build the new courts.
Okay. So I don't know what staff can do about that, but
Commissioner Mollis, I would think that the ad hoc involved in recreation should probably take that up, and that
would be great.
we not discuss that further.
That would be great.
Further here. Do you have something else you want to add?
One last thing is that on the turf management with the Coverly Field, they needed to remove at least 6 or so redwood trees. And I was fairly surprised at that, but they were not in good health. But will those be replaced or anything like that?
Yes. I believe 6 were removed, 3 were already dead, and 3 were still living. And yes, they will have replacements, not necessarily redwoods, perhaps a different species that maybe is more appropriate and might do better there.
Okay. That's it.
Commissioner Carmack, do you have any last questions or comments that you'd like to add? Is there any topics that commission members would like to recommend for future meetings?
One question.
David?
I don't, this might be for, I don't know if it's parks and facility use or park rules, but I notice a proliferation of advertising signs where the soccer teams play and other tennis classes are given, big signs, and multiple ones. And they stay up a lot longer than when they're for the event they're advertising. And I wonder, is that advertising something that they pay for?
So once again, I think I'll submit that to staff as, could you give us an update on that at the next meeting? It sounds like a reasonable question, but I think rather than discussing it now, we'll just put it as a request for staff update at the next meeting. Anybody else have anything? Keith?
I received an email today about the recycled water plan for the North County. Are we going to get a purple pipe session? Is that in the works?
That's a good idea. We did have that as an agenda item sometime. I'm not sure it showed up, but yeah, let's put that on the list as a potential topic.
Commissioner Rectal had forwarded me a number of those kind of things. I sent it to Public Works, and they said in November they'd be interested in coming to talk about that and maybe a couple other items, GSI, et cetera.
Okay, yeah, that'd be good. I don't see any particular rush, but we should get it.
Don, I was just going to echo your comment, which I think would be great to have an update on the 10.5 acres at Baylands in the not too distant future.
And specifically for the September meeting, we do have an update on the Foothills access. Anybody have anything else? Otherwise, Ann?
Yeah, the timing might be off on this for our meetings, but I wondered if we should have any kind of information about what's going on with the Stanford Gup. I mean, we mentioned it last meeting, and there's some implications for recreation, possibly, and that kind of thing. So I don't know, and maybe it's just enough to get information off the website and listen to the council meeting.
I think Commissioner Cormack might have a comment on that.
Yeah, so Councilmember Du Bois and I are the Ad Hoc Committee for the Stanford Gup, and we provided an update at the end of last week's meeting, could have been the week before, I think it was last week's meeting, just indicating that we anticipate there being a series of meetings starting in the fall in San Jose, and then potentially one up here, and that, attendance at that will be welcome, but there's no other additional information that we have to share. So I'm not quite sure what an action item or a discussion would look like, but at this point, that's where we are.
So it's good to know that you have that ad hoc committee, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be great for you to come and make a presentation from kind of Palo Alto's perspective? But if there's nothing to share,
there isn't really
then,
anything,
yeah. Okay.
The Planning Commission has recommended it's 7-0. Everything is just out in the public. We're just waiting until the next series of meetings.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, then...
I have one question. A quick question for Darren. With Rancho San Antonio closed because of mountain lions, Foothills Park, do we have any evidence of mountain lions up in Foothills Park?
We've always had evidence of them. We have wildlife cameras that occasionally pick them up, and we take notes on where they're at and monitor behaviors when we observe them or have park visitors' observations. So right now, we don't have any threats or concerns.
Don, I just have one quick question.
Sure, Jeff.
It would be about setting dates for November and December meetings, and just wondering, any discussion on that in the near future?
We haven't had discussion. We'll make sure that we have that discussion in preparation. For the September meeting, we'll lay out the rest of the year appropriately. If there's nothing else, then in record early time in my whole tenure, I would ask for a motion for adjournment.
I so move.
A second.
And everybody seconded. Thank you all very much.